Hello, I'm Nancy Naomi Carlson, and I'm moderating this pre-recorded AWP session titled Raising the Volume, Women in Translation. We're going to be having 4 award-winning poet translators working in Catalan, Croatian, Hebrew, French, and Russian, who will be discussing their advocacy efforts on behalf of women and non-binary authors they translate, including those from non-European backgrounds and those of color, as well as women writing about war from Russia and Ukraine. Each panelist will speak about 8 or 9 minutes, and then, time permitting, excuse me, I'll ask 1 or 2 questions, things I'm guessing you might have asked were you in this room with us and we were face to face. I'll introduce each panelist before they speak, starting with Aviya Kushner. Aviya Kushner is the author of The Grammar of God, Spiegel and Grau, and Wolf, Lamb, Baum, Horizon Books, forthcoming. She's the Forward's language columnist and a board member at the American Literary Translators Association. She teaches at Columbia College Chicago and translates Hebrew, poetry, and prose. Welcome, Aviya.
Thank you, Nancy Naomi, and thank you, wonderful panelists. I'm very excited to be here for this subject that is close to my heart. My talk today is called Women Who Don't Follow the Rules on Translation, Activism, and Individuality. Over the past few years, in my work as a writer, translator, and professor in one of the most racially and economically diverse arts colleges in America, I have been thinking a lot about what society expects from women. And I've also been considering the most basic problem that faces women writers all over the world, whatever their background. And that is simply what society expects women to be. What we expect of women absolutely affects women writers in translation. It helps determine whether individual women writers are translated or not, as well as how and where those translations are published and received. And interestingly, translation gatekeepers like editors, scholars, and even symposium organizers sometimes place further expectations on women writers by having some idea of what they should be writing about. Therefore, consciously or unconsciously, sometimes members of the translation community participate in narrowing readers' understanding of the full complexity of women's lives, a complexity that absolutely includes wild individuality. For centuries, the list of acceptable topics for women writers, if they were even allowed to write at all, was very short: home, family, marriage, children, possibly faith. But today, when a woman writer comes from a country that is constantly at war with the neighbors, with terrorists, with itself, we want that woman writer to flip the script entirely. We do not want her to write about home or marriage or children or the kitchen. We do not want to hear about her domestic life. Instead, we want her to write about politics. I want to unpack this expectation and consider why we want certain women to be political writers, just as we previously wanted all women to write about the domestic sphere. For starters, we assume that politics is what women in particular countries are always thinking about. From our perch thousands of miles away, often with zero knowledge of an individual poet's language or personal history, no info about her daily life other than newspaper headlines and Twitter, that's what we want her to think about. And of course, we might also be noticing the obvious, that male writers from that country often make a name for themselves by writing about politics, toggling between novels and high-profile op-eds, and opining specifically about war and terrorism. Male writers make names for themselves through political commentary of a particular kind. We want the same from women. Now, of course, there's some reasonableness to this desire. We're all shaped by our societies, we're all affected by our governments, and now everyone has to talk about Trump or comment on Brexit. But we have private lives outside of Trump and Brexit, at least I hope we do. And I believe, as someone who spent a lot of time thinking about what we expect women to be, I think there's an inherent bias in telling any writer, and particularly a woman writer, what she should write about. To my ear, it's the new way of saying your sphere is in the kitchen, stay there. It's saying, if you don't write about the subject I want to hear about in the way I want to hear about it, I'm not interested. You have nothing to add to my understanding of the world. And it's a unique form of oppression. It's an erasure of individuality. That bias is something very old when it comes to women. Because I translate contemporary Hebrew poetry, I have become intimately familiar with literary world expectations and the problem these expectations create for women writers who don't follow the script. In my experience, English language literary editors have a very particular definition of political. It's the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and that cycle of violence, not the cycle of poverty. It's not Me Too, it's not rape, it's not the astronomical cost of housing, and it's certainly not what women forced to turn to prostitution to feed their children have to do. But something that surprised me is that all these expectations multiply with age. The expectations narrow further. If a woman is older, say over 90 years old, if the literary world thinks about her at all, it expects her to write about grandchildren, memory, maybe her creaking body. No one expects her to write about the sex she is having right now. I now call all of what we expect, what editors issue calls for, and what they write notes about when they reject the translations you've sent them, expectation bias. Because women's writers' spheres are already much more limited than the spaces afforded to men, expecting international women writers to write about what we want them to write about in the way we want them to write about amounts to a double or perhaps a triple form of oppression. It's also a form of hubris. It assumes we know more than the person actually in the situation knows. I've spent the past few years translating two women poets who were entirely unknown in English when I began translating them. Both come from marginalized backgrounds. The first poet, Yudi Chahar, published her first poem at 50. Chahar writes about extreme poverty, and in particular, the struggle to survive off minimum wage jobs. The second poet, Grina Sofer, published her first book at 92, and she writes about very old age, specifically the sex lives of very old women. So I'm going to read a few of these poems so that you can hear them. The Chahar poems are from It's Me Speaking, and you will hear that her primary subject is poverty, not politics. The first poem I'll read is called The God of Secretaries. The God of Secretaries likes them looking the part, making a secretary's face in front of the mirror, click-clacking at dawn to the station, stuffing herself into a bus to a maximum-length day at minimum wage, vanishing into office space, O army of shadows of the Holy One, blessed be He. The God of Secretaries likes them looking away to the center of his stomach, Nescafe, 2 sugars, a little milk. The God of Secretaries likes them dimmed, a quiet, unclear expression on their faces, muttering, right now, of course, right now, it better be here, right now, in my hand, please. Oh, God of Secretaries, what do you understand in secretaries, in supervisors, in memoranda, when she wants to burst out in the strangest dance, but the child at home, oh, her child, God of Secretaries, you don't understand anything about secretaries, because she still climbs the stairs to class in a skirt too short for her size, takes her hand and barely covers the underwear that mother did not wash. God, what do you understand in underwear? So that's Yudi Chahar, a poet who writes a lot about economic inequality. And what I did with Yudi's poems was think long and hard about how to frame them. And I framed them, I could have framed them as feminist poems or social justice poems, but instead I chose to emphasize the subject that I felt was global, which is economic inequality. And now I'm going to share some poems from a poet who debuted at age 92 in a bookstore called The Naked Empress. And the first poem in the book is a Me Too poem, and I'll read it to you. It's called It's Me. It's me who doesn't forgive you, God of the silenced children. It's me in the closed room, the dark one, flickering between there was to here is the pain. It's me, the woman girl. Who is still mining in my body for my childhood? What are you still searching for in me? Your eyes are flooded with blood in this darkening hour. What is still left to steal in a girl? One of the things that charmed me was the portrayal of lives of the very old. And this is a poem that moved me. It's called The Meeting. Softly winter breathed between the tree's arms. A lone branch caressed the peel of a forgotten clementine hanging in the wind. Good that you came. I wanted to die. From her flesh it rose without shame. the stench of rot. And last but not least, cat. Lying cat, yowling fire, burning scent, vapors of the body. How will the lover arrive? How will his wild palms dig in the shrubs of her desire? How will it go? How will it sound? Her abandoned yowl. So my strategy was to focus on the combination of unusual elements, sex and the very old. And though there are other elements that I could have used, such as the poet's Lebanese heritage, the idea of a debut book at 92 seemed enough. And something else that what I would say is that I have also found trying unusual methods like conferences you don't usually attend as ways to gain visibility for a writer. So I would say I recommend trying conferences, trying publications that you usually don't try, framing writers in the way that you think will make them most unusual, and try your hand at literary activism, see how you do. So in summary, I would say the patriarchy, as we all know, is alive and well. There definitely is expectation bias, but we translators have power. We can widen the range of possibility by doing three things. We can preempt expectation bias by framing a writer in a unique way instead of waiting for an editor to frame that writer for us, which is how I presented Chahar as the poet of economic inequality instead of letting her be defined by regional politics that don't really apply to her. Two, we can simply let a writer be with no explanation, which is what I did with Sofer, as I simply said, these poems are about the sex life of a very old woman. And three, last but not least, we can create change by making a space in the world for women writers in translation where one does not exist through activism, by writing essays, giving radio interviews, and presenting at conferences like this one. I believe that highlighting the individuality of women is the ultimate response to the patriarchy, which does its best to flatten women into a monolith. It is up to us, translators of women writers, to present women writers in all their fullness. And in so doing, we can replace the centuries-old tyranny of expectation with the multilingual, multinational freedom of writing the world, including the magnificent and one-of-a-kind world within each of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Aviya. Sex in the 90s, abandoned yowl. Wow, and those sounds too. Now on to Sharon. Sharon Dolan is the co-winner of the inaugural Melinda A. Markham Memorial Prize in Translation, and her translation from Catalan, Late to the House of Words, Selected Poems of Gemma Gorga, will be published by Saturnalia Books in the fall of 2021. I think you're muted, and then I'll unmute.
Thank you, Nancy. I'm Sharon Dolan. The title of my talk is Where Are the Women Poets of Spain in Translation? According to 3%, as of 2019, 27% of the books from Spain that are translated into English are by women. That means that books by men account for almost 3/4 of all books translated. In my decision to focus my work as a translator on the poetry of Gemma Gorga, I am, in my small way, hoping to contribute to an increase in the number of women whose books are translated into English. In fact, my first book of translations, Gorga's Prose Poems, Book of Minutes, was published as the final book, alas, the final book in the Field Translation Series at Oberlin College Press in 2019. And as you've heard, Saturnalia Books will be publishing my translation, Late to the House of Words, Selected Poems of Gemma Gorga, later this year. While it is true that the greatest and perhaps most well-known 20th century Catalan novelist is arguably Mercè Rodoreda, with her famous La Plaça del Diamant, often entitled in English as The Time of the Doves, Catalan women poets in the 20th and 21st century received scant recognition in their home region and country, as well as abroad. In speaking with Gemma Gorga this is off the record, I recall her telling me that she would often be invited to local and international poetry festivals as the token woman poet. She was keenly aware of the paucity of women poets at these various events. In a recent email, I asked Gorga to confirm this impression, and here is what she wrote. I have the awful sensation that many invitations I receive for a jury, a reading, a talk, are because the organizers need women in order not to be criticized. Indeed, I discovered Gorga's poetry in a British anthology entitled 6 Catalan Poets, 5 of whom were men. How can a shift be effected to have more women translated into English? In my opinion, it will not come about by ghettoizing women poets. I have chosen to translate Gorga first because I find her poetry powerfully evocative, and secondarily because she is a woman. As I put it, Gemma Gorga is a poet who happens to be a woman, not a woman poet, and she concurred with this characterization of her and her work. In my current project of translating her 7th book of poems, Viatge al Centre, Voyage to the Center, I am struck over and over again by its supple use of language and white space to convey meaning. Do I think only a woman poet could use language and silence in this way? Probably not. Giuseppe Ungaretti's micropoems come to mind as precursors. Here's the famous 2-word, 2-line poem, Mattino, morning, in its entirety, and it is in the supplementary material in the handout. Mi lumino d'immenso, I light up from the immensity, or I am illuminated by immense lights, or in Jeffrey Brock's translation, I'm lit with immensity. It's impossible to achieve a satisfactory translation of this poem. Its compression, as well as its preoccupation with light, come closest to what Gemma Gorga is doing in her latest book. She has, in fact, a poem called Illumination, but I think her poem Radiance is an even better example of her palpable use of white space to suggest presence as well as absence. Here's the poem. It's also in the handout. Full go. Cum mes escric, mes invisible am torno, mas porro am meravigliosa intensitat. Radiance. The more I write, the more invisible I become, erasing myself with stunning intensity. The suggestion in these 6 short lines is to play with presence and absence, in which the letters on the page, as they take shape into words and lines, eradicate the poet, yet do so with radiant intensity. I go to poems for their use of language as well as their ability to gesture toward the unsaid, the unsayable. I prefer the understated to the overstated in poetry. Recently, I was listening to a reading and talk about translating Paul Celan by poet-translator Pierre Joris. And though there is a minimalism in Celan, it is of an entirely different order than in Gorga. In Celan, each word on the page implodes, suggesting not silence, but an infinitude, like the subatomic particles of the atom. Gorga's poems are more limpid than that. They are less interested in plumbing depths than in creating surfaces that gesture toward silence. This is the unsaid, the no speech of the blank page. So what are we to do about the paucity of women being translated? I think women have to make sure they are not colluding in the hegemonic preference for male writers. One of the translators of the Catalan poetry anthology that I mentioned is, in fact, a woman named Anna Crow. That anthology came out in 2013. I have to wonder why she did not insist on there being 1 or 2 more women among the 6 featured poets. A more recent anthology, Shesha, 14 Catalan poets, which came out from Tupelo Press in 2018, translated by a man and woman couple, does not right the balance. Only 4 Of the 14, about 28% are women. Women readers and translators themselves have to stand up for women writers. Through organizations such as 3%, VIDA, and PEN, we should continue to apply pressure on publishers to publish more women in translation. To do as Saturnalia Books has now done, created a book prize exclusively for women-identified translators translating women-identified poets. And we, as women translators, can and should make the decision to translate more women.
Thank you, Sharon. I wrote down, the more I write, the more invisible I become. And now on to Katherine E. Young, who is the author of Woman Drinking Absinthe and Day of the Border Guards, and the translator of Anna Starobinets, Akram Elizli, and Ina Kavish. Her translations of Russophone poetry have won international awards. She was a 2017 NEA Translation Fellow. From 2016 to 2018, she was Poet Laureate of Arlington, Virginia. Welcome, Kate.
Thank you so much, Nancy. My name is Katherine Young, and I want to talk first about the universe of Russian language or Russophone writing, and specifically for women. Because one would think perhaps that that was just limited to Russia, but in fact there is a huge worldwide diaspora, which includes Russia, the former Soviet republics, places like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, where Russian is the lingua franca. It's a literary language and the gateway language for translation. It also includes this universe, Ukraine, where Russian is increasingly seen as the language of colonizers and oppressors, but it's also the first language of many important writers who were born in the Soviet era. Russian language writing is produced also in the United States. There is a young female novelist with a recent hit book in Russia who is currently studying for her MFA at New York University. There is a huge community of 1 million Russian speakers in Israel. So today I'm going to be talking mostly about Russia, which is by and large the center, the remaining center of the Russian publishing universe, because that's the part of the puzzle that I know best. But I want to acknowledge the field is much larger than Russia proper. And so the question becomes, what does it mean to be a woman writer in that broader context? And I'm sorry to say that even in the year 2021, if you attach the label women's X can be poetry, it can be prose, it can be nonfiction, whatever. If you label it women's, it's immediately discounted by most of the Russophone powers that be, including publishers, editors, critics, and prize jurors. While women do have an important place in Russophone genre writing, horror, young adult, romance, that fact doesn't do much to dispel the notion that their literary work is inferior. I could talk for hours about the conditions that hold women writers back in these countries, but I don't have time to do that in this forum. And instead, I'm going to turn now to the barriers that these women face in translation. And I'm going to start with the barriers they face from within their own literary environment. Barrier number one, the Russian literary brand. Now, this may be a little bit paradoxical because Russian is the language of Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, et cetera, et cetera. In 2014, we had not one, but 2 retranslations of Anna Karenina by 2 of the most prominent translators currently working in the field. That's 2 slots that a contemporary woman writer did not get. Furthermore, as my colleagues Boris Tralyuk and Ruth Kemp have pointed out, in Russia there's a certain smugness about the literary quality of Russian writing. There's no need to do anything special to promote it, say, in the ways that the Nordic countries promote the brand of Scandinavian literature. So this is a problem for Russian women writers, Russophone writers. And at the micro individual level, there are really only a handful of literary agencies that represent Russian writers. And while they do important work, It is a big country and there are a lot of writers. So there is a problem getting these writers into contact with people who might publish them in translation. Barrier number 2, this is funding/politics. Publishers tell me that paying the translator is the single biggest expense associated with publishing work in translation. Now, the Institute of Translation in Moscow actively supports translation of work by Russian writers, but they're a small government organization with limited funding and some political constraints of their own. There is some additional funding from private foundations established by Russian oligarchs for work in translation. There is apparently some government funding that supports literary translation in Kazakhstan as well. However, you are unlikely to see funding for, say, queer women writers in countries where queerness is criminalized, including Russia, and no funding for writers whose views are in any way politically unpalatable to these funders. Barrier number 3, inequity in literary prizes. One way that American editors evaluate books that they cannot read is by the number of prizes that a book has won in its home country. But the prize system in Russia is plagued by accusations of favoritism and jury rigging. Up until very recently, prize shortlists and even long lists contained the names of very few women. So in short, prizes are an unreliable metric of good Russian writing. So now those are some of the barriers that writers face within their home context to being translated. And now let's turn to the publishing end of it in this part of the world. Barrier number 4, just the numbers. As we've all known, only about 30% of what's published in translation each year, and that entire sum of books, that's by men, women, is under 1,000 titles, and only 30% of that is originally written by women. Now, we in the Russophone community usually have about 60 titles published in any given year, although that number did fall to 48 in 2020. And that general ratio of 70-30 male-female holds true for us as well. Barrier number 5, ignorance. In the US, there is a general lack of comprehension about how vast and diverse the Russophone universe is. Editors will say, we just published a title in Russian, without any comprehension that Russian covers more than a dozen countries, hundreds of cultures, and millions of speakers. For example, I myself have translated Russian language work that's firmly rooted in the extremely different cultures of Russia, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and North Ossetia. I've even worked with a Russian language speaker from Israel. I work with women Russophone writers in both Russia and Ukraine, both groups publishing important works about the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, sometimes from similar perspectives, sometimes from conflicting ones. But by the time I explain all of this, I have generally lost most US-based editors. So we suffer from our own, what Aviya called limited or diminished expectations or expectation bias. One of the other barriers that Russophone women writers face being published in this country in translation is the desire of editors for novelty. One of the most important women writers that I translate is a middle-aged woman with some 9 books to her credit. But I constantly get solicitations to submit the work of young, undiscovered women writers. And my experience, sadly, is that a 20-something who takes a pretty picture is more likely to be published than a woman in her 50s, no matter how many books she's published in Russian. So, what can translators do about the systems that hold back women writing in Russian from being published in translation? Step number 1, notice and speak up about the inequities you see. When I submit a proposal to a publisher, I look at their catalog to see what authors they publish, including the gender breakdown, and I am not shy about pointing out why they should balance their existing offerings with work by an important woman writer such as the one I'm submitting. Number 2, step 2, advocate for institutional changes that benefit women writers in translation. I have pitched both individuals and firms on starting a prize to support poetry by a woman in translation, because with all of their problems, prizes remain one of the best ways to bring attention to good writing. And that prize now exists, no thanks to me, and our own panelist, Sharon Dolan, has just won it. That's the Markham Prize for Women in Translation, and published by a woman translator. And I am still advocating for a publishing series dedicated solely to women in translation. Step number 3, Find your allies. Publicize work by women writers in translation, even if you didn't translate. Review that work if you can. Publish it if you can do that. Join with other translators in pitching themed submissions of women's writing to editors. One of the most important developments in the area of Russophone lit is the new blog Punctured Lines, which is founded by 2 Russian-speaking immigrants to the United States who state clearly, our outlook is feminist, and we particularly want to amplify traditionally underrepresented voices. And they stand behind that statement. Recently, they threw a book launch for my translation of Look at Him by Anna Starobinets, which is a memoir of pregnancy loss that was extraordinarily controversial in Russia, but easily could have slipped under the radar here. Step 4, be intentional in what you choose to translate. Sharon spoke to this earlier. I personally make a point to seek out work by women. Step number 5, this is my last point, fight the power. Women translators must continue to challenge notions of excellence and merit that have traditionally devalued the work of women, people of color, members of the LGBTQ and differently abled communities. And this fight must be waged in both in the literary communities where the work originates and here in the translation community. More than half of translators are women, yet 70% of what's published in translation is written by men. These battles have not been won, and in some cases, they haven't yet been fought. Thanks.
So many barriers and fight the power. Thank you, Kate. Andrea Jurjević is a Croatian poet. Her debut collection, Small Crimes, won the 2015 Philip Levine Poetry Prize, and her book-length translations from Croatian include Mama Safari, Diagolos Press, 2018, and Dead Letter Office, The Word Works, 2020. She lives in Atlanta and teaches at Georgia State University. Welcome, Andrea.
Thank you so much, Nancy, and the rest of the panel. My name is Andrea Yuryovic. I wanted to talk a little bit about what kind of literature and how much of it gets from Central and Eastern Europe into the United States. So John O'Brien, the founder of the Dalkey Archive Press, he said that about 50% of literature in translation that gets to the United States is from Europe. So, I mean, and it's not big news that Europe is well represented. However, only 7% of that is literature from Central and Eastern Europe, and that's a big region. So we're talking about, that's incredibly low number, and only a tiny piece, fragment of that literature makes it to the United States. He also said that Americans have a tendency to choose one writer from a country, and not a lot of countries get chosen to begin with. So, and knowing all of this, it's as if I know one writer, there's this perception like I get the gist of it. I know what this region's literature is like. So only a tiny portion of the literature makes it to the American shore. I translate from Croatian primarily. So just to give you a little bit of context, Croatia is one of the former republics from former Yugoslavia, which used to be an ethnically diverse country. And the Croatian language, along with the Bosnian language and the Serbian language, is a variant of the same language. And it used to be formerly known as Serbo-Croatian. And between the speakers of Bosnian, Serbian, and Croatian, we're talking about 20 million people who are using this language. So this is a pretty significant region. However, and also we know that South Slavic languages, the writers from who write in South Slavic languages tend to be marginalized and underrepresented. And yet the reality is that Croatia in particular, but the entire region, has this really rich vein of literature, and that the writers there, and poets in particularly, I'm a little bit more familiar with poetry, do incredible work. And somehow or other, over the years, they haven't gotten any serious amount of attention abroad. What happens is that because it's they get kind of mixed up with other countries in the region, right? So they get translated into these neighboring languages, but it rarely make it into the English language in some kind of serious manner. So I'm saying all of this because in order to raise the volume of women in translation, what also needs to happen is that we need to broaden the Western audience's understanding of what that regional output is. And it also means to upset the conceived notions and expectations of the West as far as what the literature of that region does, right? So I have identified 3 main points that I wanted to bring up that I think are sort of like getting in the way of raising women writers, the volume. But I want to preface with this also that as translators working in English language in America, it's a matter of privilege, because once a work is translated into English, especially if it's from a minor language, that's a big deal, because then that work can travel. It can travel to other languages that are minor and also stays here for generations to come. So it's our job to do this work. As far as these 3 points that I wanted to emphasize, the first one is a matter of funding. Basically, a lot of translators are emigre writers, and they do an awful lot of work of translating, and oftentimes, most of the times, they do it without any kind of compensation whatsoever, right? So I don't know whether, well, I don't think that translation can grow significantly without there being proper funding. And I don't know how much we can significantly increase the volume of women writers without translators being paid for the work that they do, right? And what's available for translators here? I mean, we have the NEA, but it is just so embarrassingly limited, especially considering where we are at and how few people have access to it. So the issue of funding. The other one that I wanted to talk about is exposure. So especially if we're translating poetry, most likely we don't have agents. Our work doesn't end with the translation alone. Then we are submitting to journals, looking for presses, promoting not just our own translations, but the work of the writers we have translated. We are securing funding for presses that are understaffed and overextended by looking for mini grants from home countries to help publish these books and get them into the hands of the American audience. And I feel like that needs to expand. That cannot only fall on the backs of translators. There needs to be sort of like a significant cultural shift when it comes to the work of translation and the work of exposure. And the final point that I wanted to talk about, and this one it feels very close to my heart, is the need, and you guys already spoke about it, to really commit to translating and to publishing diverse and varied voices, and not to succumb to stereotypes that actually sell, right? So there's this funny, well, it's not funny, fascination of the depiction of the Balkans as this crazy place outside of the history. And the Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek talks about it a good bit. He says, you know, what we see is depictions of this place where people eat all the time, they drink all the time, excuse my language, but they fuck all the time. There's this perpetual orgy going on. And, you know, Žižek says it's a little bit of a performance for the Western gaze. And some artists whose work sold to the West, what they did, according to Žižek, he says, well, they're kind of like good hosts trying to satisfy their guests. They're entertaining, basically. One person who talked about this really nicely is Dani Lokish, the Serbian writer. And I just wanted to read one very short passage from his essay called Homo Poeticus Regardless, where he says that the Western writer is a kind of the poetic animal. The Western writer is allowed to work with the themes of mortality and love and existence and politics and everything else, whereas we tend to see certain regions, their themes, their writers' preoccupations should be put in this narrow political category. So all they are political animals, right? So this is what he says. We are exotica. We are political scandal. We are at best fond memories from the First World War and the conscience of the old Poyu Dorien and members of the resistance. We're also beautiful sunsets on the Adriatic, balmy memories of beautiful, peaceful sunsets on the Adriatic, memories dripping with Slivovica. And that's it. We are barely a part of European culture. Politics? Fine. Sightseeing? Terrific. Slivovic, as the Germans have it, naturally. But who in God's name would expect to find literature there? Who could be expected to make sense of their nationalist nonsense of all those languages and dialects so close to one another, yet so different, of all those regions and religions? So he kind of also puts the blame not just on the West, but he says some of the authors, the artists, who have succumbed to the stereotype, they exported nationalism, chauvinism, and these themes, which in essence exclude women writers. That is the biggest problem with this kind of appetite. And I've seen it in my work where people are they listen a little more closely if I write about the war, and if I write about the actual, how would I say, the suffering of the war. Once my focus, not just in translation, but in my own work, shifts to something else, it's as if interest kind of drifts away a little bit. I'm not going to read translations, but I just want to say that Olya Savicevic, whose book I translated, in her poem titled Summer 91, which was the year Croatia claimed independence and the broke out, she kind of sort of addresses this unidimensional portrayal of the region that excludes the women. She says, in the realm of war and politics, we never existed. So that's all from me. Thank you, guys.
And I think, Andrea, you had one more thing to say with the bio. Oh,
I'm not sure what if I did, I lost my thought.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you. So that brings me to me, and and I'm Nancy Naomi Carlson. And Andrea raised the issue that while 50% of all literary translations into English are from Europe, only 7% of those come from Eastern and Central Europe. And I'm guessing that the percentage of translations coming from Africa and the Caribbean is much less, and of women writers from Africa and the Caribbean, even more. The situation is more dire. And that led me to, when I first started translating, I translated René Char, a white dead guy, wonderful poet, an icon in French literature. But then as I learned more about translation, then that brought me to considering other voices. And that led me to Suzanne Dracius. And basically, I had a friend who knew of her, and she steered me to her, and I emailed her on Facebook, and she responded, and she was grateful that someone was so interested in bringing her work into English. There had been a short story that had been translated into English, a short story collection. And so we decided we were going to do this, and all of a sudden, the world of Martinique. I didn't know much about Martinique, this former French colony, and now a département of France. And so I learned about the volcano that erupted in 1902 and wiped out the entire population of Saint-Pierre. And the government insisted that everybody stay in Martinique despite the warnings of this volcano, because there was an election and they wanted to keep their power. So this whole city was wiped out by a volcano that was steam only. It was not anything else, but the steam just wiped it out. I was able to travel to Martinique to see it, to see those steps that had been charred by the volcano, to witness that even now, knowing there's this volcano and it's smoldering in the distance, it can erupt again, but folks are living at the base of it because land is at a premium. So it's a kind of interesting and unusual world for me, a worldview for me, what that's like to be living at the edge of a volcano. And yet the Martinicans have Carnival and they're dressing up and they're having wild parties for week-long wild parties. So to see this with my own eyes. And Suzanne's writing is very unusual in that she was born in Martinique, Fort-de-France, but she grew up in Paris. But in Paris, she's considered a bit too dark-skinned to fit in. But in Martinique, she's a little too light-skinned to fit in. She's a Kalazaza. She's got reddish blonde hair, and we actually have similar hair. We have frizzy hair in the humidity. But this marginalization that she feels in both places, and she writes about this marginalization in her poetry and her novels, and it was fascinating to me. Lots of Creole words there, another world opening to me. She writes about the finely calibrated differences in skin tone. So there's a continuum of black-white, and you know, in cultures like Martinique, there's if you're a quarter or an eighth black, and you're called this and you're called that. And Kalazaza, which is what Suzanne is called, is near that other part of the continuum, very light skin, but still feeling that discrimination and marginalization. So I was committed to giving Suzanne voice in English and translated her book of poems. And then I also translated her novel. I co-translated her novel where I had to, well, that's a different panel about poetry and novel writing. But I met with Suzanne because I really wanted to understand her world. And we met in Paris. We met in Fort-de-France. We had a dinner in Paris where she talked to the waiter about hazelnuts because my husband is allergic, and he assured her no hazelnuts. And then halfway into eating the hazelnut dinner, the chef comes running out and Suzanne says, no, it has hazelnut. And there was a mad dash down the Champs-Élysées to get an antihistamine so he wouldn't go into shock. But getting into worldviews, I think I feel more a need to do that with these voices that I'm not familiar with and the world is not familiar with. So I've made it my mission to discover these critically acclaimed Francophone writers. I look to see who's won prizes, and it's not that easy. And I do research. I try to ask people about women they know. And I look through anthologies. This anthology, A Rain of Words, is, there we go, is wonderful in that it's translated by Janice Mays, and it has a whole book filled with women writers from Francophone Africa. So I've found Marie-Léontine Sipanda from Congo Brazzaville, and I've translated a few of her poems, and I have in mind perhaps doing one of her plays as well, which again is not what I normally do, but it's fascinating and important work that I'd like to bring out. So what can we do about raising the volume? How do we get more women from Africa and the Caribbean and places, including the rest of the world too, heard by English-speaking audiences? And one of the experience I had last August in quarantine was the Penn Translation Committee put together a series of 3 bilingual readings And we put out a call. I had two co-organizers, Sandra Smith and Anna Dinwoody, and we put out a call. We had 80 proposals to participate. And we had started out planning on having one reading of 5 authors and 5 translators. But we were so flooded that we thought here was a chance to do some advocacy, to go through August, Women in Translation Month, and have a reading every week. So we did, and we ended up with presenters zooming in from all parts of the world, from different time zones, including Budapest, Cairo, Guatemala City, Lebanon, Peru, Reykjavik, Sri Lanka, Tehran, and the UK. And we had a veritable feast of languages: Sinhalese, Turkish, Spanish, Russian, Polish, Persian, Italian, Hungarian, Hebrew, Galician, Danish, French, and Arabic. And there was interest in these readings. They were 3 of the readings were on the Jill, a Women's Plus reading series site on Facebook, and the other was on the PEN website. And I noted that there were, I guess it was 1,500 views of one of these events. So people want to hear that and will go. If you build it, they will come. So these events are important, but as the description in our session says, there's much more work to do in raising the visibility of women authors and their translators. I'm looking here. I'm going to read one quick poem from Suzanne that I translated, which has it addresses racism and gender bias. And it's called "Racism is Soluble in Black Ink." Could France be a racist country? This is the frightening question I've been asked. In this first quadrant of the 21st century, the vile hydra has spread its virulent teratological tentacles throughout the world. A few recipes to vanquish the monster. Racism is soluble in culture stock. Let's cultivate our differences in chorus. Racism is soluble in water boiled for boudin. Let's share Creole blood sausage and heartily crunch a kha. Racism is soluble in tea punch. Let's raise a toast over a bowl of Planter's Punch. Racism is soluble in mingled bloods. Chin up, domino couples. Racism is soluble in black ink. An unequivocal kalazaza, I write in the feminine we. So that brings, thank you, to a close our prepared remarks. And it looks like we have 3 minutes and 20 seconds to address one more question, or our first question. We heard in Aviya and Kate's presentation the intersectionality of sexism coupled with ageism, determining who's getting translated, how. Do we feel that the culture makes room for the female counterpart of a distinguished older male poet? And if so, what can we do to change this cultural bias? Jump in.
I think that's a wonderful question. I actually think that the Nobel Prize for Louise Glick will help a lot in the world perception of older women writers. So I think that that's going to be very, very important. From what I'm seeing, there's, as several panelists said, there's a lot of interest in young, I would say 20-something attractive people who haven't been heard from before. And that's true both in the United States and around the world. But it's a lot harder to make the case for an older writer of anywhere. But I do actually think that the Nobel can do a lot for that.
I wanted to kind of turn the question a little bit and speak to a sort of tension that I've heard in these talks today, which is Sharon saying that she didn't think women's writing should be ghettoized, that we should actively advocate not to do that. And others of us are saying something slightly different, which is we need to promote women's writing through women's prizes and women's series about women in translation. And this is a tension that also, by the way, as a woman poet in America, in the American context, I've also found, do I submit to prizes that are open to everybody? Do I submit to prizes that are only open to women? Do I submit to prizes that are only open to women of a certain age? If you win one of those prizes, does that mean you're somehow not good enough to win a prize competition that's open to everybody? So these are really hard questions for us as writers, women writers, but also for us as translators. To me, the bottom line is I want to get my writer published for the reasons that I think Andrea suggested so eloquently. If you don't get them published in English, they're not going to get translated into other languages. So it almost, to me, it's more important to get that publication in English, even if it's from a smaller publisher in a tinier format, than to, not get published at all because you're in this giant competition with 1,100 other translators. I'm interested in anybody's thoughts on that.
Thank you, Kate. It looks like our time is up. So I wanted to thank our speakers. Oh, no, we still have some time. I don't have to cut off people. Still 4 minutes. So our time is not quite up. So let's still continue chatting. But our time will be up soon.
Kate, I think that's an issue for writers who write in English as well as writers in translation. Actually, to go back to Louise Glick, I know that there were times that she did not want to be labeled as a woman poet. She felt very strongly that was not helpful. So I think that this is an international issue. Yeah, so I would say it affects literature in general, not just literature and translation.
Any other words for the good of the cause? You heard us loud and strong.
I guess the only thing I wanted to add, I wanted to have it both ways. I want to say that I don't want to ghettoize the women writers, and yet I do want to advocate for, especially for women, well, for men as well, to be translating more women. So it's the thing that I also had wanted to stress is I think when you have an anthology where you're really shaping a particular region or country's the selection that you choose for, like, for instance, when there's Catalan poets. And I think anthologists have a lot of power. Like, for instance, Nancy is referring back to an anthology that she's for her to sort of harvest other poets from in order to translate. And I think anthologists have to be really, really careful. Maybe we should be making more anthologies, and they should be 50-50. There's no reason why, for instance, the ones that I saw, there were very strong women who were writing in Catalan. So I think anthologies in particular really anthologists, I think, have a particular responsibility. They really shape a lot of what we perceive from that particular culture.
It sounds like we've come up with some great strategies, and we have a lot more work to be done. I want to thank our panelists for a very spirited discussion, and I want to thank you, the audience, for joining us today.